Have you ever imagined a country disappearing from the map in just 2 decades? It sounds like science fiction, right? But believe me, we are facing an alarming reality that is much closer than we'd like. A small, vulnerable, and neglected country could literally vanish, and the most shocking part, this could happen within a 20-year period. The country in question? Tuvalu. A nation struggling with rising sea levels, a fragile economy, and a lack of resources to adapt to a world that ignores its needs. Today, let's understand what's at stake here and what the future of Tuvalu means for all of us. What may seem like a distant story in a secluded corner of the Pacific is, in fact, a reflection of the consequences of our own environmental negligence. Tuvalu is not just drifting, it is the symbol of a struggle that could affect us sooner than we think. So, get ready to discover how a nation can disappear in 20 years, the factors behind it, and the impact this will have on the world. Now, imagine a future where what we're seeing with Tuvalu spreads to other vulnerable countries. Are we ready to let that happen? Or can we still change the course of history? Want to know how we can prevent this from happening? If you're as curious as I am, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss any updates on this urgent issue and other topics that could change your perspective on our future. Let's explore all of this together. Tuvalu, a group of small islands in the vast Pacific Ocean, may seem insignificant to many, but its reality is a global warning. With a population of about 10,000 inhabitants, Tuvalu is a tiny country, both in terms of size and population. Its islands, many of them little more than mere sand points in the ocean, are surrounded by vast seas and are virtually no higher than 2 meters above sea level. This places the country on the front lines of climate change, with a constant and growing threat from rising sea levels that, each year, reduce its habitable land. Economically, Tuvalu is not self-sufficient. The country heavily depends on international aid, fisheries resources, and some fishing rights agreements, as well as extra income from the sale of its internet domain, which, interestingly, is one of the few sources of funding the country has. However, these revenue sources are at risk, and the reality is that, being so small and with such a fragile economic base, Tuvalu is extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in the global market and natural disasters. Politically, Tuvalu struggles to maintain its autonomy. Despite being a sovereign country, its isolated geographic location and political and economic fragility make its demands often lost in large international negotiations. Tuvalu's diplomacy mainly revolves around defending itself against the impacts of climate change. The country has joined other Pacific nations in calling for urgent environmental protection actions, but, in the face of major powers, their voices are often not heard with the attention they deserve. This scenario has proven to be not only a challenge for Tuvalu but also for the future of all countries sharing this planet. In a country where everyday life is marked by scarcity and the fight for survival, Tuvalu finds itself in a race against time. The lack of resources to face the growing environmental threat and the shortage of real international support make the country seek creative and immediate solutions, even when the signs of collapse seem insurmountable. Meanwhile, its population lives with the constant uncertainty of tomorrow, not knowing if the land they walk on today will be able to support them in the future. When we talk about the possibility of Tuvalu disappearing, we can't look at just a single isolated factor. On the contrary, it is a combination of multiple interconnected challenges that threaten the country's continuity. The first issue to highlight is the geopolitical factors. While Tuvalu has worked hard to form alliances and maintain its sovereignty, the international scenario is not always favorable. The country, with its small population and territory, does not have much political power to dispute its position in a global arena dominated by much larger nations. This is reflected in its dependence on external aid, which makes the country's political stability extremely vulnerable to changes in global interests. Furthermore, the rising sea levels and natural disasters are the greatest contributors to Tuvalu's imminent risk of disappearing. In a scenario where extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense, the survival of a country like Tuvalu becomes increasingly difficult. Sea level rise has already begun affecting the islands, causing coastal erosion, damaging infrastructure, and gradually reducing habitable land. Imagine the pain of a community that, just a few decades ago, had wide beaches and now watches their homes being swallowed by the ocean. This is the reality for the people of Tuvalu, who witness this erosion process up close and often helplessly. Another critical factor is the economic decline, which worsens each year. As mentioned before, Tuvalu depends on fishing and external sources of income, but with the increase in natural disasters, these sectors are increasingly harmed. Tourism, which could be an important revenue source, is also impacted by environmental deterioration. The growing inflation, along with the lack of infrastructure and resources, has led the country into an economic stagnation, where international investments are scarce and development is almost a mirage. The scarcity of resources and the difficulty in staying economically viable result in a vicious cycle. The more the country suffers economically, the harder it becomes to invest in adapting to environmental changes. Finally, there are demographic challenges. Low birth rates and an aging population are also issues that cannot be ignored. The lack of opportunities within the country has led many young people to migrate to other nations in search of a better life, contributing to the shrinking resident population. And the pressure on the country's already scarce resources becomes even more intense when the population ages without sufficient replenishment. This phenomenon puts even more pressure on the few remaining inhabitants and makes it even more difficult, if not impossible, to find sustainable solutions for the future. Climate change is undoubtedly the primary threat Tuvalu faces today. The rising sea levels, which seem to be a constant in news about the planet's future, are an immediate reality for the country. As the waters rise, the beaches that were once symbols of tropical paradise are now disappearing before the eyes of its residents. This phenomenon is not just about losing natural beauty, it directly impacts people's lives. The houses and infrastructure of Tuvalu, made of simple materials, are not equipped to handle the constant erosion of its shores. The salinization of freshwater sources and the loss of agricultural land mean that living conditions are becoming increasingly unsustainable. Another direct impact of climate change is the increase in the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. Tsunamis, storms, cyclones, and droughts are becoming more common. In 2018, for example, Tuvalu was hit by a devastating cyclone, which destroyed infrastructure and forced many people to migrate to safer areas. And this is not an isolated case. Extreme weather is not just changing the landscape but creating a vicious cycle of destruction and reconstruction. Each disaster worsens the country's ability to recover, while the resources to rebuild become more limited. The environmental issue goes beyond the disastrous physical consequences. Tuvalu, as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, has been an active advocate in discussions about global environmental policies. However, despite the country insisting on the urgency of the issue, the struggle for recognition of its needs is lost in a sea of unfulfilled promises and failed negotiations. Tuvalu's future is not only about survival but about global environmental justice. If no measures are taken to mitigate climate change, the situation for the country could become irreversible, making it impossible for its citizens to maintain a minimally acceptable standard of living. As climate conditions worsen and Tuvalu's economy collapses, the social and economic impact on the local population becomes increasingly devastating. Social inequality, which was already a concern in the past, now intensifies. In a country with limited resources, the disparities between those with access to security and those living in precarious conditions become even more apparent. The scarcity of food and drinking water, exacerbated by the salinization of freshwater sources, has forced communities to make difficult decisions, while the lack of employment is creating a cycle of despair. Many families face the harsh reality of not knowing where their next meal will come from, which amplifies poverty and fuels social tension. Furthermore, unemployment is one of the biggest consequences of economic failure. With the reduction of local industries, the lack of tourism, and the loss of the ability to produce sustainable resources, Tuvalu's inhabitants find themselves with no prospects for a better future. Job opportunities are minimal, and migration to other countries in search of a more dignified life becomes the only viable option for many. This creates a brain drain crisis, where the most qualified people leave, leaving behind an increasingly impoverished and disorganized country. The dilemma is simple: those who can leave, leave. And those who stay face the weight of a declining nation. All of this results in a population that is being forced to live on the edge. The constant fear of total collapse, coupled with the lack of resources for reconstruction, creates a sense of helplessness. Younger generations, with no prospect of a stable future, are beginning to lose hope. And when hope is lost, it's hard to maintain the social cohesion necessary for a country to prosper. In Tuvalu, the frustration of a nation on the brink of collapse can be seen in the streets, in the lack of trust in political leaders, and in the hopelessness in the eyes of its citizens. If nothing changes, the country's future will be marked by a large-scale humanitarian crisis. The projections for Tuvalu in the next 20 years are undoubtedly alarming. Climate studies indicate that sea levels could rise significantly, further compromising the country's territorial security. If the current rate of increase continues, Tuvalu could lose almost all of its habitable land by 2045. This process is not just a physical threat to the islands but also a severe blow to the country's social and economic structures. With increasingly restricted territory, it will not only be the local population that suffers, but also the cultural identity of the country, which will be lost with the erosion of its ancestral lands. Additionally, the lack of an effective adaptation plan further worsens the situation. The international mobilization that Tuvalu has tried to initiate vigorously over the past decades, mainly in terms of mitigating climate change and increasing global cooperation, has not been enough to change the country's fate. What we see is a desperate struggle, where promises made at international summits often remain on paper, with no effective actions taken. The global solution seems to be a vague commitment, and Tuvalu, as a small vulnerable country, remains at the mercy of an uncertain future, with few concrete options to ensure the survival of its population. Historically, the disappearance of nations or territories is not something new. An example is the disappearance of the Maya civilization, which in its time flourished and then suffered a mysterious collapse, possibly due to severe climate changes and internal wars. This shows that, although Tuvalu is small, it is part of a larger context where human actions directly impact the fate of entire nations. What is new in this scenario is the speed at which the problem is developing and the global consequences of such a collapse. What is expected of Tuvalu, then, is not just a fight for the survival of the country, but a symbol of resistance for the future of other small and vulnerable nations. Time is running out, and it's crucial that the world starts to look more seriously at these small countries, which, in some way, carry the lessons of a future that we all must face. The disappearance of Tuvalu would not only affect its own citizens, but would have direct and indirect consequences for the rest of the world. On a global level, the loss of an entire nation would be a tragedy that would symbolize humanity's failure to effectively address the climate crisis. The economic impact would also be significant. Although Tuvalu is a small country, its loss would demonstrate the failure of the global environmental governance system, which failed to protect even the most vulnerable territories. Trust in international policies aimed at climate protection would be drastically affected, generating a domino effect in other at-risk countries. Financial markets, already susceptible to environmental crises, could suffer a negative reaction with the realization that unfulfilled promises have resulted in irreparable losses. Furthermore, the social impact would be immense, especially in terms of forced migration. When an entire nation disappears, its citizens have nowhere to go but the borders of their neighbors. The migration of Tuvalu's climate refugees would affect neighboring Pacific nations but could also have global repercussions, as migration flows can create political and social tensions. Tuvalu's situation would be an amplification of the climate refugee crisis, which is already a growing concern, with millions of people displaced due to extreme weather events and environmental changes. This forced movement could overwhelm social assistance systems in countries around the world, requiring a collaborative effort to accommodate and support these populations. On the environmental front, Tuvalu's disappearance would have a symbolically enormous impact. Tuvalu is, in a way, the canary in the coal mine of climate change. The disappearance of the country would serve as a wake-up call, not only for island nations but for all coastal nations and future generations. If Tuvalu were to disappear, the repercussions for international politics and global awareness of climate change would be profound. The world would need to face the harsh reality that promises of disaster mitigation are insufficient. And above all, the loss of Tuvalu would remind us that, ultimately, we are all vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, no matter the size or location of our country. Despite the grim scenario, there is still room for hope, if action is taken now. One of the most viable alternatives for Tuvalu would be strengthening climate change adaptation policies. This would include building climate-resilient infrastructure, such as barriers against rising sea levels, drainage systems, and strategies to increase the resilience of local communities to natural disasters. However, these solutions require substantial investments, something Tuvalu, due to its fragile economy, cannot afford on its own. The international community has a key role here, not just by offering financial aid, but by creating partnerships for sustainable development. If Tuvalu receives substantial financial support from wealthier nations, it could implement these adaptation strategies, giving it more time to adjust to the impacts of climate change. Another alternative would be the partial or total relocation of the population. Although this idea is controversial and extremely difficult, in extreme situations like Tuvalu's, migration to other regions or even the creation of settlements in other countries could be a solution to ensure the survival of the population. Neighboring countries or nations with shared environmental concerns, such as New Zealand and Australia, could establish relocation programs that offer not only physical security but also opportunities for a new life, preserving the cultural identity of Tuvalu's citizens. However, this type of solution would only work if there were unprecedented international cooperation, which would require a level of global solidarity rarely seen in current political issues. Finally, international intervention is absolutely crucial. Organizations like the UN and the European Union have a vital role in creating a support network for Tuvalu. This does not mean just providing emergency aid, but also building a global structure of responsibility for climate change. Furthermore, it's important to push for more effective global action against carbon emissions and environmental destruction. Tuvalu may be small, but the impact of its struggle could be monumental if treated as a global climate justice issue. Coordinated actions and a multilateral approach are necessary to ensure that Tuvalu is not the first, but the last country to disappear due to global environmental negligence. Now, what do you think about Tuvalu's future? Is it really possible for the country to disappear in the next 20 years, or can we still change the course of this story? This is a challenge that forces us to confront our own responsibility when it comes to environmental issues. Tuvalu is not just a distant nation, it's a reflection of what could happen if we don't act quickly. If we keep neglecting the small vulnerable countries, we won't just witness Tuvalu's end, but the beginning of a cycle where the losses will multiply over time. The question remains, can we learn from what is happening in Tuvalu? What should we do, not just for them, but for ourselves? Tuvalu's fight is our fight, because, in the end, we all share the same planet. It's not an isolated problem, but a global crisis that requires immediate and decisive actions. The future is in our hands, and the choices we make now will determine whether we look back and see the disappearance of a nation or whether we will be remembered as those who managed to change the course of history. Now, it's up to you. What can we learn from Tuvalu's situation? Climate change is becoming increasingly present, and it is our duty to act before it's too late. If you agree that we urgently need to change how we handle the environment, comment below what you think should be done to avoid more tragedies like this. And, of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning about how we can make a difference. Let's work together to find solutions before the irreversible happens.